a Viking baby was born into the midst of battle, for on that day, a life did not begin. A test of survival began, and most babies failed this test. When a child entered the world in the Viking Age, it did not arrive to celebration or joy, but to a moment of silent waiting, because birth was not yet a beginning. It was a question, and the answer would come only in the hours and days that followed, when the father or the elder of the household decided whether this new life would be permitted to continue. The longhouse would fall quiet as the mother labored in the dim light of oil lamps and a fire that never fully warmed the cold air seeping through timber walls. And the women who attended her knew well that what was coming might bring grief, as easily as it brought new breath into the family. There was no physician and no medicine beyond herbs gathered from the forest, and prayers whispered to gods who did not always listen. And so the child emerged into hands that had seen many births and many deaths, and those hands would know, almost immediately, whether the infant was strong enough to survive what was waiting. This was not a world that could afford sentiment in those first fragile moments, because winter was always coming, and food was never certain, and every mouth that could not eventually work or fight or bear children was a burden that might cost the lives of others. The fire crackled, and the wind pressed against the turf roof, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the walls, wolves moved through snow that would not melt for months. And into this world, a child arrived with nothing but the faint promise of survival. The first breath was not enough, and the first cry meant little, because so many children who cried in those early hours would fall silent before the next moon rose, and every person in that longhouse understood this truth without speaking it aloud. A Viking baby did not become a member of the family simply by being born, because birth was only the first of many thresholds, and the crossing of each one required strength that could not be given, only possessed. The father would be brought to see the child, and he would look upon it with eyes that measured and calculated, because he was not yet looking at his son or daughter. He was looking at a question written in flesh and blood, and the answer he gave would determine everything. If the child appeared weak or deformed, or if the family simply could not sustain another life through the coming season, then the infant might be carried outside and left in the wilderness, where exposure would do what no one in the household was willing to do with their own hands. And this was not spoken of as cruelty. It was spoken of as necessity, and the weight of it was carried in silence by everyone who remained. The sagas do not dwell on these moments, and the stones do not record the names of children who never received names, because to name a child was to accept it, and acceptance came only after the father lifted the infant and acknowledged it as his own. Those who study this age from the comfort of warm rooms must be careful not to judge too quickly, because the people who made these decisions were not heartless. They were surviving, and survival demanded choices that would break a person if they allowed themselves to feel the full measure of what they were doing. A mother who had just endured hours of labor would sometimes watch her child carried away, knowing she might never hold it, and she would return to her work within days, because grief was a luxury that the living could not always afford, and the household needed her hands more than it needed her tears. This was the shadow that hung over every birth in the Viking world, and it was understood by all and discussed by none, because some truths are too heavy for words. The infants who were accepted into the family faced trials of their own, because survival was not guaranteed by a father's acknowledgement. It was only made possible, and the real test was the long winter that stretched ahead with its darkness and cold and the illnesses that moved through crowded longhouses like invisible predators. A baby in the Viking Age had no immunity to speak of, and no protection beyond the warmth of its mother's body, and the furs that swaddled it, and the hope that whatever sickness came through the door would pass over this small life and take someone else instead. Fever could rise in the night, and by morning a child who had been nursing strongly would lie still and silent, and there was nothing to be done except wrap the small body and carry it to the place where such bodies were left because the ground was too frozen to dig, and the living could not stop to mourn when there was wood to be gathered and animals to be fed. The frequency of infant death shaped the way these people loved their children, and it was not that they loved less, but that they loved differently, holding something back until the child had proven it could survive. And even then, knowing that survival was never permanent. A mother nursing her baby in the firelight would feel the warmth of that small body against her chest, and she would allow herself a measure of hope. But somewhere beneath that hope was the knowledge that she had felt this warmth before with other children who were no longer with her, and she had learned that hope was a fragile thing not to be trusted completely. The cradle that hung near the fire was a space of terrible vulnerability because the infant inside it depended entirely on others for everything, and if the milk did not come, or if the mother fell ill, or if the food ran out before the spring thaw, then that small life would simply end. Premature babies had almost no chance in this world because there were no incubators and no feeding tubes, and no way to keep a tiny body warm enough when it could not yet regulate its own heat, and so these children slipped away quickly, sometimes within hours of birth. Some infants were born with conditions that would be treatable today but were death sentences then, and the parents who looked upon these children faced an impossible choice between watching a slow, painful death unfold over weeks or making a quicker decision that would haunt them forever. The world offered no mercy to the weak, and the people who lived in it had learned to accept this not because they were cruel, but because acceptance was the only way to keep moving forward. A child who survived the first winter had passed a significant threshold, but there were many more winters ahead, and each one brought its own dangers, and the parents who watched their children grow did so with a kind of guarded joy that never fully relaxed into certainty. But we must also speak of the mothers, because childbirth itself was a journey through shadow, and many women did not return from it, and the baby who survived might do so only because its mother did not. There was no surgery to stop a hemorrhage, and no transfusion to replace lost blood, and no antibiotics to fight the infections that could set in after a difficult delivery. And so women died in that dim, smoky room, surrounded by those who loved them and could do nothing except watch. A breech birth could kill both mother and child, and even a normal delivery could go wrong in 100 different ways. And the women who attended knew the signs of trouble, and knew equally well that knowing changed nothing when the trouble arrived. The mother's body might simply give out after hours of labor, and the child might be pulled from her in those final moments alive, but orphaned before its first breath, and the household would be left to make sense of a grief that had no resolution. A baby who lost its mother faced a particular kind of danger because without breast milk, there was little chance of survival, and the family would have to find another nursing woman willing to take on this additional burden, and such women were not always available. Wet nurses existed, but they were not common, and the informal networks that might save a motherless infant were fragile and unreliable. And so many babies followed their mothers into death, not because no one cared, but because caring was not enough to overcome the simple biological reality that a newborn needs milk to survive. The father left behind with a living child and a dead wife would find himself in a desperate position because he could not feed the infant himself, and so he would go out into the community seeking help and hoping that someone would offer what he could not provide. Sometimes a relative would step forward, and sometimes a neighbor who had recently given birth would agree to nurse the child alongside her own, and sometimes the baby would be given to another family entirely because a single father in this world could not care for an infant without help. These arrangements were practical and sometimes cold, but they were also acts of profound generosity, because taking on another child meant sharing resources that were already stretched thin. The motherless baby who found milk and warmth in another woman's arms might never know the full story of how it came to be there, and might grow up calling someone mother who was not the woman who gave it birth, and this was simply how things were because survival required flexibility. A child might be raised by an aunt or a grandmother or a family friend, and the bonds formed in these arrangements were real and lasting, even if they were born from tragedy rather than choice. The longhouse sheltered everyone together, and the children who slept near the fire did not always sleep next to their biological parents, and the community raised its young collectively out of necessity because individual households simply could not bear all the burdens alone. As we draw back from these details, we begin to see a larger picture of what it meant to survive such a beginning. And the children who lived through their first years had already proven something about themselves before they could walk, or speak, or understand the world. They had survived the moment of judgment, when their father decided whether they would live, and they had survived the diseases that took so many infants in that first winter, and they had survived the loss of mothers who could not be replaced, and they had arrived at childhood carrying a resilience that would serve them for the rest of their lives. But this resilience was not celebrated because it was simply expected, and a Viking child who had survived infancy would face new trials as soon as it could stand, because there was work to be done and skills to be learned. A boy who had survived his first winter would eventually be expected to hold a weapon, and a girl who had survived would eventually be expected to manage a household and give birth to her own children, and face the same shadows that had surrounded her own arrival, and the cycle would continue as it had for generations. The harshness of this world was not arbitrary or cruel. It was simply the shape that life took in a land of long winters and short summers, where the margin between survival and death was never more than a few weeks of bad weather. The parents who raised children in this world loved them fiercely, even if that love was expressed differently than we might expect, and the sacrifices they made were constant and unglamorous and mostly unrecorded. These small acts of devotion happened in every longhouse, in every village, and they were the foundation upon which the Viking world was built, even if the sagas preferred to tell stories of battles and great deeds done by famous men. The babies who became children, who became adults, who became the ancestors of millions, living today, all passed through this narrow gate of infancy, and each one of them was a survivor before they knew what survival meant. When spring finally came, and the ice began to break, the babies who had made it through their first winter would feel the sun on their faces for the first time and would not understand what a triumph this was. But the adults who watched these small survivors knew, and they allowed themselves a moment of quiet relief before turning back to the endless work of staying alive in a world that offered no guarantees. The child would grow and forget these early months entirely, but its body would remember the cold and the scarcity and the closeness of death. This was the Viking beginning, not a story of glory or conquest, but a story of endurance and the fierce determination to keep living in a world that seemed designed to kill you, and the babies who survived carried something with them that no weapon or treasure could ever match.